Netanyahu and his mates seem to think that they just have to keep on killing people in Gaza long enough and they'll win. Well, they're not going to win. They're not going to win.
Commissioner Chris Sidoti, thanks so much for joining Full Story.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here with you.
Well, as UN Commissioner, you get briefings, you get updates on the latest conditions in Gaza. How would you describe the situation there at the moment?
Horrendous. The descriptions that people have been using for the last 19 months are striking in the absolute nature of them. It's been called catastrophic. One of the most surprising statements I've seen is from the International Committee of the Red Cross head, who called it hell on earth. That's surprising because the International Committee of the Red Cross is perhaps the most respected humanitarian agency and also one of the most conservative. They rarely speak publicly, and when they do speak publicly, they always speak in words of extraordinary caution. Now, for the head of the ICRC to describe the situation as hell on earth is perhaps the most telling description that I have seen about what is going on in Gaza and what the people there are experiencing.
The UK has this week said that it would suspend free trade negotiations with Israel. The EU says that it will review its political and economic pact with Israel. Are those steps anywhere near enough, given how dire the situation is?
They're steps that should have been taken a year and a half ago. And the surprising aspect now is that they're being taken at this stage and were not taken in the past. And maybe in the past, if they had been taken then, it would not be necessary to look at stronger action now. But they're very welcome nonetheless, even if late. But more is needed. I've just got to the point where I don't know what is going to persuade this criminal government of Israel to obey the law. There is no apparent understanding or willingness to accept what the law is. And there seems to be a complete imperviousness to international pressure. I mean, not even Donald Trump can persuade Netanyahu to stop the killing and feed the starving. So if the greatest arms supplier to Israel and financier of Israel can't persuade Netanyahu, I don't know what will. But certainly steps like that taken by the United Kingdom government, by the European Union now, are steps that are long overdue.
They have been close and ardent supporters of Israel. What do you think has triggered that shift now?
There are two recent developments that I think have triggered the shift. The first is the absolute siege that is now into its 81st day. There have been sieges of Gaza for a long time. There's been a partial siege of Gaza going back to 2007 when Hamas took over. On and off during the course of this latest round of fighting since 7 October 2023, the siege has been tighter or a little less tight. But the absolute siege of the last 81 days is unprecedented. And I think that many states now, including the United States, are responding to the prospect of children starving in very large numbers. The second factor is the commencement of this new Operation Gideon's Chariots, it's called. That seems to be intended to have the Israeli military occupy permanently all of the Gaza Strip. Now that represents a significant shift in the military's policy in Gaza and has worried many governments about what the implications are for the longer term. So I would say first, it's those two recent developments that are prompting action. But I would add that the bigger picture is also there. The fact that this has now gone on for 19 months has led so many other countries that are historically supportive of Israel to say, when is this going to end? Where is it going? There is no plan on the part of the Israeli government, and then there has not been throughout the 19 months for any satisfactory negotiated settlement to this fighting. And the prospect of that occurring is even less now than it was in the past. So I think it's both contemporary events and the broader picture that is causing action to occur at this time.
The UK, France and Canada put out a rather rare statement rebuking Israel and threatening sanctions. Australia was notably absent from that statement. What did you make of that?
I was surprised and disappointed. Australia should have been there. It may be that Australia had simply not been asked and the Australian government had not been consulted, in which case I can hardly blame them for not signing on when they weren't invited to sign on. Australia did sign on to another statement by it and 22 other states at about the same time as this statement by the UK, France and Canada. And that was good, but the statement by those three like-minded governments was much stronger, and I would certainly have liked to see Australia's name added to that list.
You've talked about how some of this action by other states has come too late. What is the responsibility of countries like Australia? What should Australia and other nations be doing under international law?
I go back to July last year when the International Court of Justice issued its advisory opinion at the request of the General Assembly on the lawfulness or otherwise of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli settlement policy. On that occasion, the International Court of Justice very strongly indicated that the occupation was unlawful and that the settlements were unlawful. And the court indicated that all states, collectively but also individually, had a legal obligation under international law not to aid or assist the continuation of those unlawful acts in any way. So not to do anything that would assist, encourage the continuation of the occupation or the continuation of the settlement policy. That decision should have prompted a thorough review by every government, but including the Australian government, of all aspects of the relationship between Australia and Israel. Economic, political, military cooperation, trading relationships, and so forth. And that review should have asked in relation to each aspect of the relationship, is this in any way aiding, abetting, encouraging the continuation of the Israeli government's unlawful actions? And if it found that those actions were aiding, abetting, encouraging, then action should have been taken immediately. Now, I'm not aware of any such thorough review conducted by the Australian government. It should have been conducted starting last July and being completed in pretty quick time. And it should have been made public. If there was a review, it was not made public. We don't know how rigorous it was. But my suspicion is that there was no rigorous review conducted. And we should then have responded to such a review by ending the form of cooperation that the court identified, the areas that the court identified, in any way aiding, abetting, encouraging the unlawful activity of the Israeli government. So that's what we should have done then. And that's a continuing obligation. It's not a one-off thing that having failed to do it last July, August, we are no longer responsible. We are responsible. And the responsibility is even greater now than it was then, because the Israeli government and the Israeli military have been continuously committing war crimes in Gaza since then. And there is no doubt about that, and it's getting worse. So the obligation now is even heavier than it was then.
Commissioner, there has been a consensus emerging. Many organisations and scholars have concluded that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. That is a question that you're still assessing, that the Commission is still assessing. When will those findings be released? Where are you at in that process?
We hope to be able to release a report on that subject towards the end of the year. It's a difficult question, and I have to say that because of the complexity of the question, it needs to be preceded by rigorous fact-finding, investigation and fact-finding. And to date, that's where we've been putting our priority. In our reports, which are numerous now, we have been presenting parts of the picture of what is going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in Israel itself. And in collecting that information, undertaking the investigation, forming our conclusions, we are laying the groundwork for our assessment of whether genocide exists. We have said since last June that the actions of the Israeli authorities constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. But those categories of international crime are not as complex, not as complicated to establish as the crime of genocide. The law of genocide, rightly, is heavy in the requirements for establishing genocide. You not only have to have acts, but also a genocidal purpose, the purpose of committing those acts with the intention of destroying a group in whole or in part. And identifying the genocidal purpose is the challenge. Now, we're well into that now, having gathered through our reports and presented our findings, the results of our investigations. We are now in a position to start looking at whether the elements of the law of genocide have been met. If they have, why? And if they haven't, then why not? And I anticipate a report being released towards the end of the year.
Back in 2023, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that Israel was, quote, fighting human animals. Just last week, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich said, quote, now we conquer, cleanse and stay. How much do statements like that factor into your considerations?
They're very significant. And we have been collecting these kinds of statements by Israeli leaders, civilian and military, since the 7th of October 2023, and indeed even before that, looking at what their intentions are. So genocidal purpose is certainly established by clear statements. The statements need to be made by people in some areas of authority so that they can be acted on. So, for example, if someone on the street made a statement that is clearly indicating a genocidal intent, that may be incitement to genocide, but it doesn't necessarily prove genocide being committed by the armed forces, because the armed forces aren't under the control of that person. But when we're looking at statements being made by the Defence Minister, by the Army Chief of Staff, by the President, by the Prime Minister, these are all extremely relevant.
I want to turn now to some work that you've been directly involved in. UN Women estimates that more than 28,000 women and girls have been killed in Gaza since October 2023. That is one woman and girl on average killed every hour in attacks by Israeli forces. You've investigated Israel's use of gender-based violence. What did you find?
We found that women and girls are dying at a disproportionate rate. I mean, that sounds awful, doesn't it? It sounds like it's just a statistical question. But to look historically, there have been many periods where violence has exploded in Gaza over the last 20 years. And when we've looked back over the casualty figures, deaths and injured, in each of those explosions of violence over a 20-year period, we have seen that the proportion of deaths that are deaths of women and girls has been steadily increasing from one campaign to the next. In the earlier period, the proportion of deaths who were women and girls was less than half of what it is now. So the proportion of deaths among women and girls is much greater than it's ever been historically. We see that as the result of two factors. The first is that residential buildings are now being targeted. There seems to be no constraint on the part of the authority given to the Israeli forces in relation to what buildings to attack. And as the infrastructure has been destroyed, hospitals, schools and other places, more and more we are seeing residential buildings, and that's where women and children are. So the greater death toll is inevitable when residential buildings are being bombed. The second factor is that it seems that the operating instructions given to the military are much more tolerant of civilian deaths than they were in the past. It seems that the formula that we can tolerate so many civilian deaths for the death of a militant, or more civilian deaths for the deaths of a Hamas commander, those figures have been greatly relaxed or expanded, whichever word you like, so that there is authority to accept the killing of larger number of civilians than at any time in the past. Now, as a result of those two factors, there is no doubt we are seeing very significant increases in the number of women and girls, or women and children generally, killed.
The report said that Israel had carried out genocidal acts. Could you elaborate what constitutes a genocidal act, and what is that distinction between what we were discussing earlier?
Yes. Um, a genocidal act is part of an analysis of the law of genocide. Like with any crime, genocide as a crime has both acts and intentions. These are the two standard elements of a crime. You have to commit an act that is a criminal act and commit it with a particular intent. And without the intent, you can't establish criminal responsibility. So far as genocide is concerned, there are 5 categories of genocidal act. And so the first step in examining whether any situation constitutes genocide is to ask whether what is occurring in that situation falls within one or more of those categories of genocidal act. It's not necessary to establish all 5. They're not cumulative. Any one of the 5 is sufficient to establish that the act part of genocide has occurred. Now, in the case of examining the situation of women and girls in Gaza, we have found that 2 of those genocidal acts have occurred, or two of the categories of genocidal act. More broadly, in our analysis of those 5 categories, there is strong evidence to indicate that the acts that have occurred in Gaza fall within 4 of the 5 categories of genocidal act.
Israel didn't cooperate with that investigation, your investigation into the systemic use of gender-based violence against the Palestinians. How did it respond to that report, and what do you make of Israel's response?
Israel never cooperates with any investigation by anybody.
Why?
Just because it refuses to cooperate because it doesn't want to be found responsible. Its policy in relation to evidence, in relation to inquiries, investigations, and in relation to criticism, is a policy of blanket denial. And by cooperating, it's worried that investigators like us will find even stronger evidence to hold Israel accountable for the actions that have occurred. But even when the United States undertook an investigation into the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, a US citizen, Israel refused to cooperate. When the United States has sought to inquire into the deaths of other American Palestinians at the hands of Israeli security forces, Israel has refused to cooperate. So it's not just us. It makes our investigations more difficult, of course, but it doesn't make them impossible. And their policy, the last part of your question, how do they respond? They always respond with blanket denials and with lies. And they can't be taken seriously, and they're not intended to be taken seriously. The Israelis know that nobody believes them anymore, but they go through the motions.
You've previously said that everyone should be sceptical of anything the Israeli government and military says. You say now that Israel is putting out lies. Do you think that Israel's allies, Australia and others, agree? Why do you think that they continue to receive support from other Western nations?
They receive support from other Western nations because of the broader politics of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. It's not because anyone believes what they have to say. Perhaps the most dramatic example has occurred in the last couple of days, where the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister, persistently state that there is no starvation in Gaza, that everything's fine, that they have enough food and supplies. Now, even President Trump said last weekend that people in Gaza are starving. So if the President of the United States doesn't believe you, one of the greatest supporters of Israel, nobody else can believe them either.
We've talked about Western allies. I want to ask you about the media. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese says that, quote, "This is a genocide that has been justified and enabled by Western media." She says that the media has amplified Israeli fabrications. I wonder what your assessment is of the way that the media has covered and reported over the last 18 months and indeed before that.
I see and I read both a wide range of approaches being taken by the media, some of which is very credible and some of which is totally incredible. You can dismiss anything in the News Limited media from the get-go. And wherever News Limited has media outlets, whether it's newspapers or TV or whatever, the same ideological lines are pursued, and there is no point in giving any credence to it at all. There are other parts of the news media that are trying to do a decent job, but they're very worried about being criticised. And we know that the defenders of Israel are amongst the most dedicated and vitriolic critics of anything that they see as being criticism of Israel. I mean, that's what they're doing, that's their job. And I think parts of the media are very worried about that because they are subjected to such intensive pressure. And we've seen that here in relation to the ABC, for example. Now, there are other parts of the media, again, that are less worried about that criticism, are more committed to factual reporting, to investigation, to analysis, and I think they're doing a good job. So the picture is varied, it's mixed. And I should say as well, there are some parts of the media that are ideologically pro-Palestinian, and everything that they publish is attacking Israel and defending Palestine. And to take an example, I can't defend, I don't want to defend, and I will not defend what happened on the 7th of October. But there are some media outlets that have even been defensive of that. So we find the whole spectrum of ideological position and of professionalism in the media.
Are you ever personally frustrated by the lack of interrogation on the part of the media of some of those, as you put it, lies by the Israeli government?
I am indeed. I would very much like to see a far more critical approach taken towards what the Israeli government is saying, calling them out. There is an obligation on the media not just to report that someone said something, but to critically analyse what has been said. And I think Francesca is quite right in saying that those who are critical of Israel are subject to more intensive examination by the media than those who are defensive of Israel are.
Human rights groups have repeatedly said that Israel is acting with impunity. Do you believe there will be accountability for those responsible?
First, Israel is acting with impunity, and it always has. And it will continue to do so until there is accountability. So accountability is not just about justice for the past, it's also about deterrence for the future, to prevent these things from happening again. I'm an old man. I've been around for a long time. I've learned, unfortunately, to be patient.
How do you have faith that it will happen when Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is invited and welcomed into the White House by the US President, even whilst there are outstanding warrants for his arrest for war crimes?
The only places in the world where Netanyahu can go are the United States and Hungary. Now, he shouldn't be able to go to the United States and Hungary without being arrested, but when he flew to the United States, they had to chart a special flight path that only flew over international waters, because his plane could have been forced down in any of the countries of Europe and North Africa and have him arrested and sent to The Hague. The fact that an arrest warrant has been issued against Netanyahu, has been issued against former Defence Minister Gallant, I see as very significant developments. Now, significant but small. The really significant progress will be when we see these two and others hauled up before the International Court of Justice and required to give an account of themselves and their actions.
The UN released a statement earlier this month which called on states to end the unfolding genocide or watch it end life in Gaza. This was a group of UN experts. Do you think the world will act? We started this conversation talking about, I guess, the delay in the response from some of Israel's allies. Do you think that the world will finally act?
I'm confident that this round of fighting will finally end. I don't know when. It should have ended long before this. But the simple truth, the historical experience of this war that goes back 100 years, is that each round of fighting has to end, because fighting is not going to resolve anything. And that's the deeply bitter and tragic irony, is that Netanyahu and his mates seem to think that they just have to keep on killing people in Gaza long enough and they'll win. Well, they're not going to win. They're not going to win. Israel's security, to which Israelis are entitled, lies in coming to terms with the aspirations of the Palestinian people. And in the same way, the security of Palestinians can only be achieved as part of a negotiated settlement with Israelis. Now, this latest round of fighting will end.
Will it end with Israel reoccupying the entirety of Gaza?
In the short term, it may. But if that's the basis on which this round of fighting ends, it guarantees that there will be another round of fighting, and then another round of fighting. What really needs to happen at this point is that other states, including Australia, say, enough. This tragedy has gone on for almost a century. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and millions have suffered. Enough. There needs to be a resolution of the issues, a resolution that respects the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people and not just of the people of Israel, and a basis upon which two peoples can live in peace, in security, and enjoy mutual prosperity. And until that happens, we are going to see continued rounds of killing like this one. This one is longer, deadlier, more brutal, and more criminal than any that has preceded it. But it's not the first, and unless there is a true peace settlement, it will not be the last.
Commissioner Chris Sidoti, thanks so much for your insights and expertise.
Thank you, and thanks for asking me on the program.